Welcome to Cosy Night Stories, where we listen and relax, and we get sleepy. I will be telling you 3 different stories. Let's begin with the first story about Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow, and the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as snow, with lips as red as blood, and hair as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after that she had a little daughter who was as white as snow. Her lips were as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The looking glass answered, "Thou, O queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once when the queen asked her looking glass looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" It answered, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." Then the queen was shocked and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the girl so much. And envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her, and bring me back her lung and liver as a token." The huntsman obeyed and took her away. But when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, you poor child. The wild beasts will soon have devoured you," thought he. And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer needful for him to kill her. And as a young bear just then came running by, he stabbed it, and cut out its lung and liver, and took them to the queen as proof that the child was dead. The cook had to salt them, and the wicked queen ate them, and thought she had eaten the lung and liver of Snow White. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at all the leaves on the trees, and did not know what to do. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would go, until it was almost evening. Then she saw a little cottage, and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which was a white cover, and 7 little plates, and on each plate a little spoon. Moreover, there were 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side and covered with snow-white counterpanes. Little Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short, But at last she found that the seventh one was right, and so she remained in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs, one who dug and delved in the mountains for ore. They lit their 7 candles, and as it was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. 1. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" 2. The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" 3. The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" 4. The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" 5. The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" 6. The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" 7. The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked round and saw that there was a little hollow on his bed, and he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up, and each called out, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein, and he called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh heavens," cried they, "what a lovely child!" And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed. And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so passed the night. When it was morning, little Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly, and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. Then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day, until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart," and she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings they went to the mountains and looked for copper and gold. In the evenings they came back, and then their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's lung and liver, could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. And she went to her looking-glass and said, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought and thought again how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land, envy let her have no rest. And when she had at last thought of something to do, she painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and no one could have known her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, and knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out of the window and called out, "Good day, my good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," she answered, "stay laces of all colors," and she pulled out one which was woven of bright-colored silk. "This lace is very cheap. It only costs 5 euros, which is a bargain, because on the internet you won't find it below $1.10. Just check eBay." "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion. but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, but how shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved, and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and as they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the laces. Then she began to breathe a little, and after a while came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care, and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "O queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was again alive. "But now," she said, "I will think of something that shall really put an end to you." And by the help of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door, and cried, "Good things to sell, cheap, cheap." Little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone come in." "I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so well that she let herself be beguiled, and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb you properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion, and let the old woman do as she pleased. But hardly had she put the comb in her hair than the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "you are done for now," and she went away. But fortunately it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother, and they looked and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen at home went in front of the glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered as before, "O queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." Thereupon she went into a quite secret, lonely room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it, but whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself up as a farmer's wife, and so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me." "It is all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer, and stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she a bit of it in her mouth than she fell down dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look, and laughed aloud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. This time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she asked of the looking-glass at home, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? And it answered at last, "O queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They lifted her up, looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was all of no use. The poor child was dead and remained dead. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat round it and wept for her, and wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said we could not bury her in the dark ground, and they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides. And they laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too, and wept for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders. And it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump, and with the shock the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat, and before long she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, sat up, and was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You are with me," and told her what had happened, and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife." And Snow White was willing, and went with him, and their wedding was held with great show and splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. When she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before the looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far as I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace, and had to go to see the young queen. And when she went in, she recognized Snow White, and she stood still with rage and fear, and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put upon the fire, and they were brought in with tongs, and set before her. Then she was forced to put on the red-hot shoes, and dance until she dropped down dead. Now we begin in our next story, the tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along, and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently Peter sneezed. "Curty scoo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity, lippity, not very fast, and looking all round. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scrr, rich, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. Now we begin on our third and last story, The Tooth Fairies in the Cleaning Factory. Deep in the New Forest, where no big people ever went there was a tiny little magical village called the Orden Gardens. Here 3 little tooth fairies named Incisor, Canine, and Molar were busy at work at their factory. The 3 tooth fairies were all named after types of teeth. Incisor was tall and skinny with short pink hair. Canine was also tall with blue hair, and Molar was the short wise one with curly silver locks. All day long, the busy little fairies cleaned and shined the children's milk teeth they had collected during the night. The milk teeth were used to make very useful things in the Orden Gardens, like roads in the village and furniture in the homes for the little fairies. One day, Incisor realized that the teeth coming into the cleaning factory were not as strong as they used to be. "Oh dear," said Incisor, "these teeth are fragile and brittle with holes and black spots. They crumble as soon as I try to polish them with my cloth. Whatever are we to do?" "Yes," said Canine, "I know exactly what's wrong. The children are beginning to eat far too many sweets and are not looking after their teeth at all." "I know, we can fix it," said Molar, the wise one. She sounded quite excited by her grand idea. The 3 fairies looked at each other and waited while Molar explained all. As usual, it was a fabulous idea. The 3 of them wasted no time at all and got to work straight away. That night, it was Canine's turn to fly off and collect all the milk teeth from under the sleeping children's pillow. Off she flew with a bag of coins, some whiteberry sandwiches for her lunch, and a pack of cards which the 3 fairies had spent all afternoon preparing. It was such a treat to leave the forest and see the city skyline, but it was a dangerous place for fairies. Canine had to make sure that the big people never saw her. She flew through the starry sky and saw the wonderful city fast asleep. Her first stop was a young boy named Junior. Earlier in the night, Junior and his mom had placed his milk tooth under the pillow. Mummy tucked Junior into bed and told him all about the tooth fairy who would leave some money in exchange for his tooth. She gave him a goodnight kiss and left him to fall asleep. By the time Canine arrived, Junior was fast asleep. She flew in through the top window that was ajar and glided quickly down to Junior's pillow. She perched beside him and braced herself in preparation for the task. "Heave." She lifted the pillow and wedged herself between the pillow and the bed. She quickly grabbed the tooth and tossed it over to her backpack. She placed 2 coins in the fairy's special card in exchange under the pillow and flew off into the night sky to find more milk teeth. In the morning, as soon as Junior woke up, he rummaged under the pillow to see if the tooth fairy had left any money for him. He was thrilled to find the coins, but looked blankly at the card he found in his hand. Mummy didn't mention anything about a card, he wondered. He read the card out aloud. The Tooth Fairy's Guide to Healthy Teeth. 1. Eat healthy. 2. Cut down on sugary sweets and drinks. 3. Brush your teeth twice a day. 4. Use a fluoride toothpaste. 5. Visit the dentist regularly. Back in the village of Orden Gardens, the fairies were very happy about the new information card they were giving to the children. Soon enough, the milk teeth coming into the factory were strong and healthy again. The end.